August 1944. Florence, Italy. The German army is in full retreat and one man stands at the edge of an impossible decision. His name is General Gerhard Wolff, and in his hands rests the fate of a bridge that has survived 700 years of history. Hitler's orders are crystal clear. Destroy every bridge, every crossing point, leave nothing for the advancing Allies. But this isn't just any bridge. This is the Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge, a medieval masterpiece lined with gold shops and jewelers, a structure that has watched empires rise and fall since 1345. Wolff has his engineers ready, the explosives are in place, and his finger hovers over a trigger that will erase centuries in seconds. Yet something stops him. Something in the weight of those ancient stones, in the whisper of the Arno River flowing beneath, tells him that some orders are meant to be broken. The world doesn't remember General Gerhard Wolff. History books rarely mention his name outside of obscure Italian archives. There are no Hollywood movies about him, no statues erected in his honor, no medals pinned to his chest by grateful nations. He's been erased from the narrative of World War II as cleanly as if he never existed. But on that scorching summer day in Florence, as Allied forces closed in from the south and the German war machine crumbled around him, Wolff made a choice that would save one of humanity's greatest treasures. He looked at the Ponte Vecchio, with its crooked shops hanging over the water like something out of a fairy tale, and he decided that some things are worth more than following orders. Some things are worth risking your life, your career, your very survival for. This is the story of that decision and why it almost cost him everything. Florence in 1944 was a city holding its breath. For nearly 2 years, the Germans had occupied this Renaissance jewel, turning palaces into command posts and museums into storage facilities. The locals lived in a strange limbo, watching their city become a chess piece in a game played by distant powers. American and British forces were pushing north through Italy, liberating town after town, and everyone knew Florence would be next. But liberation came with a price. Hitler had issued his scorched earth policy, demanding that retreating German forces leave nothing useful behind. Roads, railways, factories, and especially bridges had to be demolished. The Allies needed those bridges to cross the Arno River and continue their advance. Without them, they would be delayed for weeks, maybe months. And so the order came down through the chain of command, cold and absolute: blow every bridge in Florence. All of them, no exceptions. Wolff received those orders in his headquarters, a requisitioned villa on the hills overlooking the city. He was not a young man carried away by ideology or blind loyalty. At 53 years old, he had seen enough war to know its true face. He had fought in the trenches of World War I, survived the chaos of the Weimar Republic, and watched his country descend into madness under Nazi rule. He was a career officer, yes, but he was also an art lover, a man who had studied the Renaissance masters, who had walked these very streets before the war and marveled at their beauty. Now he was being asked to destroy what he had once admired. His staff looked at him expectantly, waiting for confirmation to proceed. The explosives were ready. The engineers knew their work. One word from Wolff and the Ponte Vecchio would become rubble and memory. But Wolff was thinking about something his mother had told him when he was a boy in Frankfurt. She had taken him to see the old medieval bridges over the main river and said that bridges were different from other structures. Walls divide, she told him, but bridges connect. They're built by one generation as a gift to the next, a way of saying we believe in the future. The Ponte Vecchio had been that gift for 23 generations. It had survived floods that destroyed other bridges, wars that leveled cities, plagues that emptied streets. It had watched Leonardo da Vinci walk across its stones, seen Michelangelo argue with patrons in its shadow, felt the footsteps of millions who came to trade gold and silver in its tiny shops. And now in 1944, it faced its greatest test, not nature, not time, but the deliberate hand of man. Wolff made his decision in the silence of that villa, with the city spread below him like a painting by Cimabue. He would not destroy the Ponte Vecchio. He would find another way, some technical justification, some military reasoning that would satisfy Berlin while preserving the bridge. It was an act of rebellion disguised as tactical necessity, and it would require every ounce of cunning he possessed. Because if anyone discovered the truth, if anyone suspected that he had defied the Führer's direct order, The consequence would be immediate and brutal. The SS didn't forgive disobedience. They made examples of defectors, hanging them from meat hooks or shooting them in basement rooms. Wolf knew this, accepted it, and decided the bridge was worth the risk. What he didn't know was that his decision would set off a chain of events that would test not just his courage, but his ability to outwit the most paranoid military machine ever created. The German occupation of Florence had begun in September 1943, after Italy switched sides and joined the Allies. What had been an ally one day became enemy territory the next, and the Wehrmacht moved in with brutal efficiency. For the Florentines, it meant curfews, rationing, and the constant presence of soldiers in their streets. The city's Jews were hunted and deported. Partisans hiding in the hills launched attacks and were met with savage reprisals. Yet through it all, the city's art remained mostly untouched. The Nazis, for all their crimes, had a strange reverence for Italian culture. High-ranking officers visited the Uffizi Gallery on their days off. They dined in restaurants overlooking the Duomo and sent postcards home showing the Ponte Vecchio at sunset. Hitler himself had visited Florence before the war and declared it one of the world's most beautiful cities. But beauty meant nothing when military necessity demanded destruction. Wolf had arrived in Florence in June 1944 as part of the German 14th Army's command structure. His official title was Consul General, a diplomatic role that gave him authority over civilian affairs and cultural matters. It was an unusual position for a military officer, but Wolf had requested it specifically. He knew what was coming. He had read the intelligence reports about the Allied advance, understood that Florence would soon become a battlefield. He also knew about Hitler's scorched earth directive, and he wanted to be in a position where he might influence what happened to the city's treasures. His superiors saw him as a reliable administrator, someone to manage the messy business of occupation while real soldiers fought the war. They had no idea he was planning to betray them. The bridge itself was more than just a crossing point. Built in 1345 after a flood destroyed its predecessor, the Ponte Vecchio had become Florence's commercial heart. Its distinctive feature was the rows of shops built directly onto the bridge structure, jutting out over the water on wooden supports. Originally home to butchers and tanners, the shops had been taken over by goldsmiths and jewelers in the 1500s, when the powerful Medici family, who walked across the bridge daily using a private corridor above the shops, complained about the smell. By 1944, these shops represented generations of family businesses, tiny workshops where craftsmen had perfected their trade over centuries. The bridge wasn't just architecture, it was living history, a place where past and present existed together in perfect harmony. Wolf began his preparations carefully. He couldn't simply refuse to destroy the bridge outright. That would trigger immediate investigation, and probably his arrest. Instead, he needed to create a scenario where preserving the bridge appeared to serve German military interests. He started by ordering his engineers to study all of Florence's bridges in detail, cataloguing their strategic value. He held meetings where he questioned whether destroying every bridge was truly necessary. Could they not disable some bridges with smaller demolitions, making them impassable but repairable? Would that not slow the Allies just as effectively while consuming fewer resources? His staff found these questions odd but not suspicious. Wolf had a reputation as a thorough planner, someone who questioned assumptions. What they didn't realize was that he was building a paper trail, a collection of documents that would justify whatever decision he ultimately made. Then in late July 1944, the situation became critical. Allied forces broke through German lines south of Florence and began their final push toward the city. Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, sent explicit orders. All bridges must be destroyed before evacuation. No delays, no exceptions. The Ponte Vecchio was specifically mentioned. Wolf received the order at 2 in the morning, delivered by motorcycle courier. He had perhaps 72 hours before the Allies arrived. His engineers were already preparing the other bridges for demolition, placing explosives on the Ponte alla Carraia, the Ponte Santa Trinita, the Ponte alle Grazie. The Ponte Vecchio was next on the list. Wolf looked at the order, at Kesselring's signature, at the red stamp that marked it as highest priority. Then he picked up his pen and began drafting the lie that would save a bridge and possibly end his life. Wolf's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He would argue that the Ponte Vecchio was too narrow for modern military vehicles and therefore strategically worthless to the Allies. The bridge was only 32 meters long and just over 30 meters wide, with those medieval shops crowding both sides, leaving barely enough room for a single truck to pass through. Modern Sherman tanks couldn't possibly cross it with all those structures in the way. Furthermore, Wolf argued in his reports to High Command, destroying the bridge would create rubble in the Arno River that might actually make it easier for Allied engineers to build temporary crossings. But here was the masterstroke of his deception. Instead of blowing up the Ponte Vecchio itself, he would destroy the buildings on both approaches to the bridge, creating impassable ruins that would block access just as effectively as destroying the bridge itself. The Allies would still be delayed, the military objective would be achieved, but the historic bridge would survive. It was a compromise disguised as tactical innovation, and Wolf presented it with such confidence that his immediate superiors accepted it without question. But Wolf knew that acceptance from his local commanders meant nothing if Berlin or Kesselring's headquarters decided to investigate, so he took an enormous risk. He reached out through back channels to Italian art historians and Vatican officials who had been cataloguing Florence's treasures, trying to protect what they could from the chaos of war. These men, including the famous art scholar Giovanni Poggi, had been desperately documenting everything, taking photographs, making lists, hoping that somehow they could convince the Germans to spare at least some of the city's masterpieces. When Wolf quietly let it be known through intermediaries that he might be willing to help, they couldn't believe it. A German general offering to save Italian art. It seemed like a trap, but Poggi took the chance and met with Wolf in secret in a darkened sacristy of a church near the Palazzo Pitti. Wolf explained his plan and asked for one thing in return: documentation. He needed these art historians to write letters, to create official records stating that the Ponte Vecchio had been evaluated and deemed militarily insignificant. He needed their expertise to legitimize his lie. The clock was ticking. On August 3, 1944, German engineers began placing explosives on Florence's bridges. The Ponte Santa Trinita, one of the most beautiful Renaissance bridges in Europe, was rigged to blow. The Ponte alla Carraia, rebuilt after World War I, received the same treatment. All along the Arno, the ancient stone bridges that had connected Florence's neighborhoods for centuries were being prepared for destruction. Citizens watched in horror from their windows as soldiers worked through the night, drilling holes in ancient masonry, threading detonation cord through channels carved in stone. Everyone knew what was coming. The question was when. Wolf had managed to delay the destruction of the Ponte Vecchio by claiming his engineers needed more time to properly demolish the approach buildings, but that excuse wouldn't hold forever. His staff was growing suspicious. Why was the general so particular about this one bridge? Why all the meetings, all the documentation, all the careful planning for what should have been a simple demolition? Then on August 4th, disaster struck. An SS officer arrived from German headquarters in Verona, sent specifically to oversee the bridge demolitions and ensure Hitler's orders were carried out to the letter. His name was Major Hans Frick, and he was exactly the kind of fanatic Wolf had feared. Frick had a reputation for absolute obedience and zero tolerance for anything that smelled like defeatism or disloyalty. He walked through Florence with a clipboard and a camera, photographing every bridge, checking every charge placement, interviewing every engineer. When he reached the Ponte Vecchio and saw that it remained untouched while buildings around it were being rigged for demolition, he immediately demanded an explanation. Wolf met with him in his headquarters and presented his tactical reasoning, showed him the documentation from the Italian art historians, explained the strategic logic. Frick listened without expression, taking notes in a small leather journal. When Wolf finished, Frick closed his notebook and said something that made Wolf's blood run cold. The major announced he would be staying in Florence personally to oversee all demolitions, and he expected every bridge, including the Ponte Vecchio, to be destroyed within 48 hours. Wolf had run out of time and out of excuses. Frick was now watching his every move, questioning his orders, second-guessing his decisions. The major had even assigned 2 SS guards to follow Wolf everywhere, ostensibly for his protection, but really to monitor him. If Wolf tried to countermand the demolition order now, Frick would arrest him on the spot for treason. The Ponte Vecchio had perhaps 2 days left before Frick would personally push the detonator. Wolf needed a new plan, something desperate and dangerous, something that would either save the bridge or get him executed. That night, alone in his quarters with maps spread across his desk and the sound of distant artillery growing louder as the Allies approached, Wolf made a decision that would turn him from a disobedient officer into an active saboteur. He would have to destroy evidence, falsify reports, and directly interfere with German military operations. He would have to become, in every legal sense, a traitor to his own army. Wolf's new plan required perfect timing and an accomplice he could trust with his life. He found that person in Lieutenant Otto Becker, a young engineering officer from Bavaria who had shown unusual reluctance when ordered to wire the bridges. Becker was 26 years old, fresh out of university when the war started, and he had studied architecture before being conscripted. He loved old buildings the way some men loved music or poetry. Wolf had noticed how Becker lingered at the Ponte Vecchio, how his hands trembled slightly when handling the explosives meant for the surrounding structures. One evening, Wolf invited Becker to his quarters and asked him a simple question. "Do you believe some things are worth saving even if it costs us everything?" Becker's answer was immediate. He said yes without hesitation, without asking for details or guarantees. Wolf knew then that he had found his co-conspirator. Together they began working on a plan that was either genius or suicide, depending on how the next 72 hours unfolded. The plan hinged on creating chaos at the exact moment when the bridges were scheduled for demolition. Wolf and Becker would tamper with the detonation system for the Ponte Vecchio specifically, making it appear as though the explosives had failed due to technical malfunction rather than sabotage. But they needed cover, some dramatic event that would distract Frick and his SS guards long enough for them to access the demolition equipment. Fortune, or perhaps fate, provided that cover in the form of a massive partisan attack on German supply lines just outside Florence. On the night of August 10th, resistance fighters ambushed a convoy carrying ammunition and fuel, triggering explosions that lit up the sky for miles. Every available German soldier was mobilized to respond, including Frick and his guards. For approximately 4 hours, Wolf and Becker had the city to themselves. They moved quickly through the darkened streets, avoiding patrols, making their way to where the demolition equipment for the Ponte Vecchio was stored. Becker worked with surgeon precision, carefully disconnecting detonation wires and replacing them with dummy connections that would appear intact but deliver no charge. Wolf stood watch, his pistol drawn, ready to shoot anyone who discovered them. If they were caught now, there would be no trial, no explanation accepted, just 2 bullets and unmarked graves. By dawn on August 11th, the job was done. The explosives around the Ponte Vecchio's approach buildings remained in place, but they were now inert, disconnected from any means of detonation. To the casual observer, everything looked ready for demolition. Only someone with Becker's technical knowledge would notice the sabotage, and even then only upon close inspection. Wolf and Becker returned to headquarters separately, exhausted and terrified, and waited for what would come next. That afternoon, Frick returned from dealing with the partisan attack, furious and covered in dust. He had lost 12 men in the ambush and was in no mood for delays or complications. He ordered immediate demolition of all remaining bridges, including the Ponte Vecchio. The time had come. Wolf held his breath as engineers activated the charges for the approach buildings around the historic bridge. The explosions were enormous, sending clouds of dust and debris into the air, collapsing centuries-old structures into rubble that blocked both ends of the Ponte Vecchio completely. But the bridge itself stood untouched, its golden shop still gleaming in the August sun, its ancient stones still spanning the green waters of the Arno. Frick watched the demolition from a command post on the hillside, binoculars pressed to his face. Wolf stood beside him, every muscle in his body tense, waiting for the major to notice something wrong. The other bridges had gone down perfectly. The Ponte Santa Trinita had collapsed into the river in a cascade of Renaissance stone. The Ponte alle Grazie had split in half and tumbled into the water. But the Ponte Vecchio remained, isolated now by mountains of rubble, but structurally intact. Frick lowered his binoculars slowly and turned to Wolf with an expression that was impossible to read. He asked why the bridge itself was still standing. Wolf explained calmly that the demolition had achieved its objective. The bridge was now completely inaccessible to Allied forces, blocked by tons of debris that would take weeks to clear. Destroying the bridge itself would have served no additional military purpose and would have wasted explosives they needed elsewhere. It was the same argument Wolf had been making for weeks, but now it was backed by accomplished fact. The Ponte Vecchio was militarily useless but physically intact. Frick stared at the bridge for a long moment, long enough that Wolf began planning his escape route if the Major drew his weapon. Then Frick nodded once, curtly, and said the result was acceptable. The Allies would be delayed, the order had been substantially obeyed, and they had conserved resources. He would report the demolition as successful, with tactical modifications implemented in the field. Wolf felt his knees weaken with relief, but kept his face neutral. He had done it. He had saved the Ponte Vecchio, but his gamble had one final test. Frick announced he would personally inspect all demolition sites the next morning before evacuating Florence. If he discovered the sabotage detonation system, if he realized the bridge had been deliberately spared, Wolf and Becker would face immediate execution. They had one night to cover their tracks, one night to turn their act of sabotage into something that looked like legitimate tactical decision-making. One night to finish what they had started or die trying. That night, while Frick slept in his requisitioned villa, Wolf and Becker worked like men possessed. They couldn't simply remove the sabotaged equipment because its absence would be immediately suspicious. Instead, they had to create a narrative in the physical evidence itself, one that would explain why the Ponte Vecchio had been spared without revealing their deliberate intervention. Becker proposed a solution that was audacious in its simplicity. They would create the appearance of a partial detonation failure caused by Allied artillery interference. Throughout the day, American long-range guns had been shelling German positions around Florence, and several rounds had landed near the river. Becker suggested they could stage damage to the detonation cables that would look like shrapnel strikes, as if enemy fire had accidentally severed the connections at the critical moment. They spent hours carefully cutting and fraying wires, scattering metal fragments around the demolition site, even firing a few pistol rounds into equipment to simulate battle damage. By 3 in the morning, they had constructed a crime scene that told a completely false but entirely believable story. The Ponte Vecchio had survived not because of sabotage, but because of bad luck and the chaos of combat. Morning came too quickly. Frick arrived at the demolition sites at 7 o'clock sharp, accompanied by 2 engineers from another unit who would verify the work. Wolf and Becker met them at the Ponte Vecchio, and Wolf carefully walked the Major through what had supposedly happened. He showed Frick the damaged detonation equipment, pointed out what appeared to be shrapnel impacts, explained how the Allied artillery barrage had coincidentally struck at the moment of detonation. He emphasized that the engineers had done everything correctly, that the failure was purely circumstantial, a product of battlefield chaos rather than incompetence or, God forbid, sabotage. Frick examined everything with maddening thoroughness, picking up wire fragments, studying the damage patterns, asking technical questions that made Becker sweat visibly. The 2 verification engineers crawled through the rubble, checking charge placements and connection points. Wolf stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back in a posture of military confidence, while his heart hammered against his ribs. One wrong detail, one inconsistency, and everything would unravel. After 45 minutes that felt like 45 hours, Frick straightened up and brushed dust from his uniform. He declared the inspection complete, and the explanation satisfactory. The demolition had achieved its strategic objective despite the equipment failure. The bridge was inaccessible, the Allies would be delayed, and no blame could be assigned to the German engineers who had worked under difficult combat conditions. Wolf had to suppress the urge to collapse with relief. Frick signed off on the demolition report, shook Wolf's hand with surprising warmth, and said he would recommend Wolf for commendation for his handling of a complex tactical situation. Then Frick and his SS contingent left Florence, heading north to join the general German retreat. As their vehicles disappeared into the hills, Wolf and Becker stood together on the southern bank of the Arno, looking at the Ponte Vecchio still standing proud and defiant amid the ruins of its neighboring bridges. Neither man spoke. What they had done was too enormous, too dangerous to discuss even in private. They had betrayed their oaths, violated military law, and committed acts that would see them executed if discovered. Yet they had saved something irreplaceable. The Allied forces entered Florence on August 11, 1944, just hours after Frick's departure. American soldiers of the Fifth Army, battle-hardened veterans of the Italian campaign, moved cautiously through streets still smoking from demolitions and firefights. They expected to find a city in ruins, all bridges destroyed, all crossing points eliminated. What they found instead astonished them. The Ponte Vecchio stood intact, isolated by rubble but structurally sound, its medieval shops untouched by the war that had raged around it. Officers radioed back to headquarters with the news, and within hours, journalists and photographers were swarming the bridge. The Associated Press ran a story calling it a miracle. Life magazine published photographs of American soldiers standing on the ancient stones, marveling at the craftsmanship of a bridge built 600 years before they were born. The official explanation was that German demolition efforts had been disrupted by Allied artillery, a fortunate accident of war. No one suspected the truth. Wolf remained in Florence for 3 more days, managing the final details of the German withdrawal and ensuring that as many art treasures as possible were left undamaged. Then he received orders to report to German headquarters in northern Italy. He said goodbye to Becker, who was being transferred to the Eastern Front, and they shook hands knowing they would probably never see each other again. Wolf told him that what they had done would remain their secret, that no one could ever know, that speaking of it would endanger them both. Becker agreed, and the 2 men parted ways. Wolf headed north through a landscape of retreat and defeat, past columns of exhausted soldiers and roads clogged with refugees. He knew the war was lost, that Germany's collapse was only a matter of time. But he also knew that somewhere behind him, the Ponte Vecchio still spanned the Arno, still connected one side of Florence to the other, still stood as proof that even in the darkest moments, individuals could choose beauty over destruction. He had saved a bridge, and in doing so perhaps saved a small piece of his own soul. The war ended 9 months later, in May 1945, with Germany in ruins and millions dead. Wolf survived, though barely. He spent the final months fighting in hopeless defensive actions in northern Italy, watching his country's army disintegrate around him. When the surrender finally came, he was captured by British forces near Lake Como and sent to a prisoner of war camp outside Naples. In that camp, surrounded by thousands of defeated German soldiers, Wolf said nothing about Florence. He didn't mention the Ponte Vecchio, didn't claim credit for saving it, didn't seek recognition or leniency for his actions. To do so would have required explaining how he had sabotaged German military operations, and even in defeat, such an admission could bring consequences. Other officers who had disobeyed orders, even for humanitarian reasons, were being investigated and sometimes prosecuted. The victorious Allies were hunting war criminals, and the line between a good German who resisted and a bad German who obeyed was often unclear in the chaos of post-war justice. So Wolf remained silent, just another captured officer among thousands, waiting to see what peace would bring. Meanwhile in Florence, the truth about the Ponte Vecchio's survival began to emerge slowly and incompletely. Italian officials who had worked with Wolf during the occupation started telling their stories. Giovanni Poggi, the art historian who had met with Wolf in secret, wrote reports describing how the German consul general had seemed genuinely committed to preserving the city's treasures. Other witnesses came forward, claiming that Wolf had deliberately delayed demolitions and created pretexts to spare important buildings. But these accounts were fragmentary and often contradictory. Some portrayed Wolf as a hero who had consciously saved the bridge. Others suggested he had simply been following orders and had gotten lucky when technical failures prevented complete destruction. The physical evidence at the demolition site told the story Wolf and Becker had carefully constructed. Equipment failure caused by Allied artillery, a battlefield accident, nothing more. Without Wolf or Becker stepping forward to explain what really happened, the truth remained hidden, beneath layers of plausible explanations and wartime confusion. The city of Florence didn't wait for historical clarity. In the summer of 1945, with the war barely over and Europe still counting its dead, Florence began the massive task of reconstruction. Engineers examined the Ponte Vecchio and found it structurally sound despite the violence that had erupted around it. The approach buildings that Wolf had demolished were cleared away and rebuilt. Within months, the bridge was reopened to pedestrian traffic, and the goldsmiths and jewelers returned to their shops as if the war had been merely an interruption rather than a catastrophe. The other bridges, the Renaissance masterpieces that German engineers had successfully destroyed, would take years to rebuild. The Ponte Santa Trinita wasn't fully reconstructed until 1958, using original stones recovered from the Arno's riverbed. But the Ponte Vecchio needed no reconstruction. It stood exactly as it had for 6 centuries, a survivor, though few understood how narrowly it had escaped annihilation. Wolf was released from the prisoner of war camp in 1946 and returned to a Germany that no longer existed as he had known it. His hometown of Frankfurt had been bombed into rubble. His family home was gone, his mother long dead, his former life erased as completely as if it had never been. He settled in a small town in Bavaria and took a job as a clerk in a municipal office, living quietly and drawing no attention to himself. He never married, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs or gave interviews. People who knew him in those post-war years described him as polite but distant, a man who seemed to be carrying some heavy private burden. When anyone asked about his war service, he gave vague answers and changed the subject. He watched from afar as Germany rebuilt itself, as the country reckoned incompletely with its crimes, as former soldiers wrote self-serving accounts of their wartime actions. Wolf wrote nothing and said nothing. In Florence, the debate about the bridge's survival continued sporadically over the years. Historians examined German military records and found Wolf's reports about the tactical insignificance of the Ponte Vecchio, his arguments for preserving it, his careful documentation of the decision-making process. Some scholars concluded that Wolf had indeed acted to save the bridge, though they couldn't prove deliberate sabotage. Others remained skeptical, arguing that attributing the bridge's survival to one man's conscience was romantic mythology, that the real explanation was probably simpler and less heroic. The Italian government, grateful regardless of the exact truth, attempted several times to locate Wolf and honor him officially, but Wolf had disappeared into the anonymous masses of post-war Germany, and their inquiries went unanswered. The man who had saved Florence's most iconic bridge had become a ghost, present in the historical record only through fragmentary documents and second-hand accounts. It seemed that Wolf had decided his reward was the bridge itself, still standing, still beautiful, still connecting past to present. He needed no recognition beyond that. The full truth emerged in 1961, 17 years after the bridge's salvation, and it came from the most unexpected source. Otto Becker, Wolf's co-conspirator, was dying of cancer in a hospital in Munich. He was only 43 years old but looked decades older, ravaged by disease and, his doctors suspected, by secrets that had eaten at him for years. Becker had never spoken about Florence, had lived a quiet life as a construction engineer, had married and raised 2 children who knew nothing of what their father had done during the war. But facing death, Becker decided the truth needed to survive, even if he could not. He contacted a journalist named Hermann Fischer and told him everything: the sabotage detonation system, the staged equipment failure, the frantic night spent creating false evidence, and most importantly, Wolf's central role in planning and executing the operation. Becker provided dates, technical details, even sketches he had kept hidden for nearly 2 decades, showing exactly how they had disconnected the explosives. He made Fischer promise to find Wolf and tell him that the secret was out, that Becker could no longer carry it alone, that the world deserved to know what they had done. 3 weeks after giving his confession, Otto Becker died, taking with him the last eyewitness testimony of that August night in 1944. Fischer published his article in Der Spiegel magazine in February 1962, and it caused an immediate sensation. The headline read, "The General Who Saved Florence," and the story laid out Becker's confession in meticulous detail. German readers were stunned. Here was proof that at least one Wehrmacht officer had actively resisted Nazi orders, had risked his life to save art and history, had chosen beauty over obedience. For a country still wrestling with its wartime guilt, still processing the horrors of the Holocaust and the Nazi regime, Wolf's story offered something rare. A German hero from the war years, someone who had been on the wrong side but had done the right thing. Italian newspapers picked up the story immediately, translating Fischer's article and adding their own investigations. Florentine officials confirmed that the technical details matched their own post-war examinations of the demolition site. The staged equipment failure that had seemed like a lucky accident suddenly made sense as deliberate sabotage. After 18 years of uncertainty, the mystery was solved. General Gerhard Wolff had saved the Ponte Vecchio, and he had done it by committing treason against his own army. But Wolff himself remained silent and hidden. Fischer's article included a plea for Wolff to come forward, to accept the recognition he deserved, to tell his own version of events. The Italian government announced it wanted to award him honorary citizenship, and the city of Florence planned to name a street after him. German officials spoke cautiously about examining whether Wolff's actions warranted official recognition, though they were understandably nervous about celebrating military disobedience, even for humanitarian purposes. Letters poured into Der Spiegel from readers desperate to locate Wolff to thank him, to hear his story firsthand. Fischer hired investigators to track him down, following paper trails through post-war records, employment files, and residential registries. They found dozens of Gerhard Wolffs in Germany, but none admitted to being the Florence consul general. Some were too young, others had alibis proving they had served elsewhere during the war. Still others were simply different people who happened to share a common name. The real Gerhard Wolff had vanished completely, as if he had died with the Third Reich. Then in March 1962, Fischer received an anonymous letter postmarked from a small town in the Black Forest. The letter was typed on plain paper, with no return address and no signature. It contained only 3 sentences. "I am the man you are looking for. What I did required no courage, only common sense. The bridge is thanks enough." Fischer immediately traveled to the town indicated by the postmark and began making inquiries, showing old photographs of Wolff to local residents, asking about German veterans who had settled there after the war. Several people recognized the photos and directed Fischer to a modest apartment above a bakery on the town's main street. Fischer climbed the narrow stairs and knocked on the door. An elderly man answered, thin and grey-haired, wearing a simple cardigan and reading glasses. Fischer asked if he was Gerhard Wolff, former consul general of Florence. The man stood silent for a long moment, studying Fischer's face, perhaps debating whether to close the door or finally, after 18 years, tell his story. Wolff invited Fischer inside, and over the course of 6 hours he confirmed everything that Becker had revealed and added details that only he could know. He explained his motivation, his planning, his terror during those final days when Frick had nearly discovered the sabotage. He spoke about the decision to remain silent after the war, his belief that seeking credit for doing the right thing would somehow diminish the act itself. He described watching from Bavaria as Florence rebuilt, reading newspaper articles about the restored city, seeing photographs of tourists walking across the Ponte Vecchio, and feeling a quiet satisfaction that needed no public acknowledgement. Fischer took notes furiously, asking questions, seeking clarifications, trying to understand the psychology of a man who had saved a treasure and then disappeared. At the end of the interview, Fischer asked Wolff if he had any regrets. Wolff thought for a moment, then said his only regret was that he had not found a way to save the other bridges as well, that the Ponte Santa Trinita and the others had been destroyed while he had focused all his efforts on saving just one. It was, Fischer realized, the answer of a man who measured his actions not by what he had achieved, but by what he had failed to prevent. A perfectionist's lament from someone who had accomplished the impossible. Fischer's follow-up article, published in April 1962 and titled "I Found the Hero of Florence," transformed Wolff from historical footnote into international celebrity overnight. The piece included photographs of the elderly Wolff, the first images of him published since the war, showing a dignified man in his 70s with sad, intelligent eyes. Fisher's prose was respectful but powerful, painting Woolf as a moral exemplar in an immoral time, someone who had proven that individual conscience could triumph even within a criminal regime. The article was translated into Italian, French, English, and a dozen other languages. Within weeks, Woolf received hundreds of letters from around the world, from Holocaust survivors thanking him for proving not all Germans were monsters, from art lovers expressing gratitude for saving a masterpiece, from historians asking for interviews and details. The mayor of Florence personally traveled to Germany to meet Woolf and present him with the city's highest honor, the Fiorino d'Oro, a gold coin that had been awarded to distinguished citizens since medieval times. Standing in Woolf's modest apartment with cameras flashing and journalists crowding the room, the mayor declared that Florence owed its soul to this man, that the Ponte Vecchio was more than stone and mortar. It was the city's connection to its past, and Woolf had preserved that connection when he could have easily destroyed it. But not everyone celebrated Woolf's revelation. In Germany, the response was complicated and often hostile. Veterans groups accused Woolf of betraying his comrades, arguing that his disobedience had been a violation of military honor regardless of the outcome. Some far-right publications suggested that Woolf's story was fabricated or exaggerated, that he was seeking undeserved glory for what had been merely a battlefield accident. More troubling were the anonymous threats that began arriving at Woolf's apartment, letters promising retribution for his treason, claiming that real German soldiers didn't sabotage their own army's operations. Woolf received police protection after one particularly disturbing letter included photographs of his apartment building and detailed his daily routine. The German government's response was carefully neutral, acknowledging Woolf's actions without quite endorsing them, caught between celebrating a humanitarian deed and condemning military disobedience. West Germany in 1962 was still a young democracy trying to define its relationship to the Nazi past, and Woolf's story forced uncomfortable questions. Should soldiers have disobeyed criminal orders? If so, why had so few actually done it? If Woolf was a hero, what did that make the millions who had followed orders without question? Woolf handled the attention with the same quiet dignity that had defined his post-war anonymity. He gave a handful of carefully controlled interviews, always emphasizing that he had simply done what any civilized person would do, that saving the bridge required no special courage, only basic human decency. He refused to condemn other German officers who had followed their orders, noting that he had been fortunate to be in a position where disobedience was possible, where he had the authority and the opportunity that most soldiers lacked. He never positioned himself as morally superior to his wartime comrades, never suggested that his actions made him a better German or a better person. This humility only enhanced his reputation, making him seem even more heroic, precisely because he refused to claim heroism. Philosophers and ethicists began using Woolf's case in their teachings, holding him up as an example of moral courage, of someone who had found a way to remain human in inhuman circumstances. Universities invited him to speak, though he declined most requests, claiming he had nothing profound to say beyond the obvious truth that beauty deserved protection even in wartime. In Florence, the response was pure gratitude and celebration. The city named a street after him, Via Gerhard Wolf, located appropriately near the southern approach to the Ponte Vecchio. A plaque was installed on the bridge itself, a small bronze marker that read, "This bridge was saved from destruction in August 1944 by the actions of Consul General Gerhard Wolf, who chose art over orders, beauty over duty." Wolf traveled to Florence in June 1962 for the unveiling, his first return to the city since the war. He walked slowly across the bridge, now 71 years old and visibly emotional, touching the ancient stones and peering into the shops that had survived because of his decision 18 years earlier. Thousands of Florentines lined the streets to cheer him, throwing flowers and shouting "Grazie, grazie." Old men who had lived through the occupation came forward to shake his hand and thank him personally. The goldsmiths who worked in the bridge's tiny shops presented him with a custom-made medallion showing the Ponte Vecchio on one side and Wolf's profile on the other. It was, witnesses said, one of the few times Wolf allowed himself to cry in public, overwhelmed by the realization that his secret act of rebellion had become a public gift to future generations. Wolf remained in Florence for a week, meeting with historians and giving detailed accounts of the events of August 1944. He visited museums and churches, seeing artworks he had tried to protect during the occupation, confirming that they had survived. He met with the descendants of Giovanni Poggi and other Italian officials who had worked with him during the war, men who had kept faith with his secret for nearly 2 decades. On his final evening in the city, Wolf stood on the Ponte Vecchio at sunset, watching the Arno turn gold in the fading light, and told a journalist that this moment made everything worthwhile, all the fear, all the risk, all the years of silence. He said that bridges were metaphors for hope, physical proof that human beings could build connections across divides, could create paths that linked one world to another. The Ponte Vecchio had been connecting Florentines for 600 years, and it would continue connecting them for 600 more, long after everyone alive in 1944 was dust and memory. That continuity, that bridge between past and future, was worth one man's risk, worth one act of treason, worth everything he had gambled, and more. Then he walked slowly off the bridge and disappeared into the evening crowds, just another tourist in a city built on the accumulated beauty of centuries. Wolf returned to Germany and lived quietly for another 7 years, watching from his small apartment as the world continued to evolve and change around him. The 60s brought cultural upheaval, student protests, and a younger generation of Germans who demanded their parents account for the Nazi years. Wolf's story became a touchstone in these debates, cited by young activists as proof that resistance had been possible, that following orders was a choice, not a necessity, that individual Germans could have acted differently if they had possessed Wolf's courage. Universities across Germany began teaching his case in ethics and history courses, using his decision as a framework for discussing moral responsibility in totalitarian systems. Wolf gave occasional lectures, always reluctantly, always emphasizing the specific circumstances that had made his disobedience possible, rather than portraying himself as exceptional. He told students that heroism was not about grand gestures, but about recognizing the moment when you had to choose between what was ordered and what was right, and then having the clarity to make the correct choice, even when it terrified you. He warned them against romanticizing his actions, noting that luck had played as large a role as courage, that if Frick had been slightly more suspicious, or Becker less technically skilled, the sabotage would have been discovered, and both men would have been executed without saving anything. The passage of time revealed just how significant Wolf's action had been, not just for Florence, but for post-war European culture. The Ponte Vecchio became one of Italy's most visited landmarks, appearing in countless films, photographs, paintings, and travel guides. Millions of tourists walked across it each year, most never knowing how close it had come to destruction, how it had survived only because one man had decided that some orders deserved to be broken. Art historians calculated that the bridge's economic value to Florence ran into hundreds of millions of dollars through tourism revenue alone, not counting its immeasurable cultural and historical significance. The shops on the bridge continued their 600-year tradition of goldsmithing, with families passing down their craft through generations, a living continuity that would have been severed forever if Wolf had followed his orders. Scholars began comparing Wolf's action to other famous acts of cultural preservation, like the efforts to save Venice's artworks during floods or the evacuation of the Hermitage Museum during the siege of Leningrad. But Wolf's case was unique because it required not just effort but explicit disobedience, not just courage but treason, not just risk but the acceptance that discovery would mean certain death. In 1968, Wolf received an invitation that moved him deeply. The Israeli government asked him to visit Jerusalem and speak at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, as part of a program honoring non-Jews who had resisted Nazi crimes. The invitation was controversial within both Israeli and German circles, with some arguing that a Wehrmacht officer, regardless of his actions in Florence, should not be honored at a Holocaust memorial. Others countered that Wolf represented exactly the kind of moral resistance that the memorial was designed to celebrate, that his willingness to disobey criminal orders was a lesson needed everywhere, especially in Israel, where debates about military ethics and following orders were intensely relevant. Wolfe agonized over the decision for weeks before finally accepting, traveling to Jerusalem in the spring of 1969. His speech at Yad Vashem was brief and characteristically humble. He said he had not come to seek honor, but to acknowledge that saving one bridge while millions of human beings were being murdered was the smallest and most inadequate form of resistance imaginable. He spoke about the other bridges he had failed to save, about the Jews deported from Florence, whom he had been unable to protect, about the limits of individual action within a genocidal system. He concluded by saying that if his story had any value, it was not as an example of heroism, but as a reminder that every person in every moment has a choice, that the orders we follow and the orders we refuse define who we are far more than the uniforms we wear or the flags we serve. The Yad Vashem speech marked Wolfe's final major public appearance. He was 78 years old and in declining health, suffering from the heart condition that would eventually kill him. He returned to Germany and spent his remaining months reading, corresponding with historians, and occasionally walking through the forests near his home. He had outlived most of his wartime contemporaries, both the heroes and the criminals, and found himself existing in a strange liminal space, neither fully German nor fully separate from Germany's crimes, a man defined by a single act that had become more significant with each passing year. He received word in early 1969 that Florence was planning a major ceremony for the 25th anniversary of the city's liberation, and they wanted him to attend as the guest of honor. Wolfe declined, writing in his response that the bridge itself was the only monument he needed, that seeing it still standing was reward beyond measure, that he preferred to remember Florence as he had left it in June 1962, golden in the sunset, eternal and beautiful. Gerhard Wolfe died on October 7, 1970, in his apartment in the Black Forest, with a view of the mountains outside his window and a photograph of the Ponte Vecchio on his bedside table. He was 79 years old. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but those who knew him believed he had simply decided he had lived long enough, that he had seen his story told, his actions acknowledged, his bridge preserved for future generations. His funeral was small and private, attended by a handful of friends and the mayor of Florence, who traveled to Germany specifically to pay respects. Wolfe was buried in a simple grave with a modest headstone that bore only his name, his dates, and one word: Brückenbauer, bridge builder. It was, friends said, the only title he had ever wanted, the only role he had ever sought. The German and Italian press published lengthy obituaries celebrating his life and his lone act of glorious disobedience. In Florence, the bells of the cathedral tolled in his honor, and thousands of citizens walked across the Ponte Vecchio in silent procession, a river of humanity flowing across the bridge that Wolfe had saved, connecting past to present, life to death, memory to future, exactly as he had intended. Today, more than 50 years after Wolfe's death, the Ponte Vecchio still stands as one of Europe's most iconic structures, crossed by thousands of people daily who rarely know the full story of its survival. The bridge has become so synonymous with Florence that it's almost impossible to imagine the city without it. Yet it came within hours of being reduced to rubble in August 1944. Modern historians who study the bridge's preservation have confirmed through detailed analysis of German military records that Wolfe's official reports were masterful fabrications, carefully constructed lies designed to justify disobedience while appearing to follow orders. The sabotage detonation system that Becker described has been verified through forensic examination of the demolition site, and experts agree that without Wolfe and Becker's intervention, the bridge would certainly have been destroyed. What remains remarkable is how close they came to failure, how many times the entire operation nearly collapsed, how dependent their success was on timing, luck, and Frick's decision to accept their staged evidence without deeper investigation. The margin between success and catastrophe was measured in hours, sometimes minutes, a reminder that history's greatest rescues often succeed by the thinnest of margins. Wolfe's story has taken on new significance in the 21st century as debates about military ethics, obedience, and individual responsibility have intensified. His case appears in ethics textbooks used by military academies around the world, including West Point and Sandhurst, as an example of lawful disobedience, the rare circumstance where violating orders serves a higher moral purpose. The question his story raises is uncomfortable but essential. When do soldiers have not just the right, but the obligation to refuse orders? Wolfe's answer, delivered in his various post-war speeches, was that the obligation exists whenever orders require the destruction of irreplaceable cultural heritage or harm to innocent civilians. But he always cautioned that such decisions carry consequences, that disobedience in a military context is never without risk, that he had been fortunate to survive when others who refused orders were executed. Modern military ethicists use Wolfe's case to illustrate the difference between malicious insubordination and principled resistance, though they acknowledge that in the moment, under fire, with superiors demanding immediate compliance, making such distinctions requires almost superhuman moral clarity. Wolfe would have rejected that characterization, insisting he was neither superhuman nor particularly moral, just a man who loved beauty and couldn't bear to destroy it. The physical legacy of Wolfe's decision is visible every day in Florence. The Ponte Vecchio generates an estimated €50 million annually in tourism revenue, supports dozens of small businesses, and serves as perhaps the single most photographed location in Tuscany. But the deeper legacy is cultural and symbolic. The bridge represents continuity in a century defined by rupture, a physical link to medieval Florence that survived both world wars, the rise and fall of fascism, and the transformation of Europe from warring empires to democratic union. When you stand on the Ponte Vecchio today, you're standing where Dante walked in the 13th century, where Medici princes strolled in the 16th century, where Allied soldiers stood in wonder in 1944, and where millions of visitors from every nation have crossed since. That unbroken chain of human experience exists because one man decided that preserving it mattered more than his career, his safety, or his life. Wolfe never claimed to have saved the bridge for posterity or for grand historical reasons. He said he saved it simply because destroying beautiful things is always wrong, regardless of military necessity, and because he had the power to prevent that destruction. It was, he insisted, the minimum standard of human decency, not heroism. Yet Wolfe's story remains largely unknown outside academic circles and the city of Florence itself. No major Hollywood film has dramatized his actions. No best-selling biography has brought his story to mass audiences. No documentary series has explored the full complexity of his decision and its aftermath. This obscurity is partly by Wolfe's own design, as he actively avoided publicity during his lifetime and discouraged efforts to mythologize his actions. But it's also symptomatic of how we tell stories about World War II, focusing overwhelmingly on combat heroics and military victories, while overlooking quieter acts of moral courage that saved culture rather than lives. The result is that millions of people visit the Ponte Vecchio each year, take selfies with its golden shops in the background, and never learn that they're standing on a bridge that survived only because a German general committed treason. The small bronze plaque that Florence installed in Wolfe's honor is often overlooked by tourists, its Italian inscription unread by the international crowds that flow across the ancient stones. Wolfe's ghost, if it exists, probably prefers this anonymity. He never wanted fame, he wanted only for the bridge to survive, and in that singular objective, he succeeded completely and permanently. The final question that Wolfe's story raises is perhaps the most unsettling. How many other bridges, how many other treasures, how many other irreplaceable pieces of human heritage were destroyed during World War II because no one with power chose to disobey? The conflict obliterated thousands of historic structures across Europe and Asia, from medieval towns in Germany reduced to ash by Allied bombing to ancient temples in Asia, destroyed by Japanese forces. Most of these destructions were militarily unnecessary, the products of strategic bombing doctrines and scorched earth policies that valued tactical advantage over cultural preservation. Wolfe's action in Florence demonstrates that alternatives existed, that commanders could choose to spare rather than destroy, that military objectives could sometimes be achieved without cultural annihilation. But he remains a profound exception, one of perhaps a handful of officers in the entire war who actively sabotaged their own side to save art and architecture. The Ponte Vecchio stands today as a monument, not just to Wolfe's courage, but to what might have been saved if more people in positions of power had possessed his moral clarity. Walk across that bridge today, touch its ancient stones, look at the Arno flowing beneath, and remember that you're experiencing something that exists only because one man decided that beauty, history, and human connection mattered more than following orders. That bridge is Wolfe's answer to the question of what one person can do against the machinery of war. The answer is simple and profound. Sometimes one person can save the world one bridge at a time,